Hey everybody, welcome back to Elemental Gardens. Today I'll be working on the entrance building and the main street of the park, or at least part of it. And it'll all be pretty much in a very similar modern style to what I've made the observation tower in. So let's get started and actually build the street itself. I wanted to make sure that I had the general look of the street before I went into the buildings that I'm going to place around it to actually make the main street. And I figured I could actually make my own lampposts over here because looks a bit more interesting, I guess, than the in-game lampposts, which are bound to get boring after a while. And it's pretty easy to just build one of these and then just copy it around the park. So I went ahead and just made some very simple modern lampposts. I have to say the entire main street is going to have a very modern kind of style to it. More about that later, because it's not necessarily modern, but yeah, more about that later. Anyway, it's a very contemporary, not exactly futuristic, but just very recent style to the entire main street, which is kind of weird for an amusement park, but then again, that's also kind of why I wanted to try it. So I've got the lamps in there, which are all looking very modern and sleek, and I figured one way that I could solve the problem of these lamps not actually being functional like the in-game lights are was to put a area light under the ground underneath these lights to kind of make them still function as actual lampposts. And that is actually something that works quite well, so you can very easily just make your own lampposts and make sure that they're actually lighting up the area underneath and around them by placing the area lights wherever you need to. So that was something I did, and afterwards I figured I would quickly get into some planters for the side of the sidewalks here, because otherwise the entire main street would just turn into a sort of barren, desolate, lifeless street, and that was something that I definitely wanted to avoid. So these planters, along with the trees that are going to sit inside them, should hopefully add some much needed greenery to the main street and make it all a little bit cozy. Because even though I am obviously going with a very modern sort of architecture style, I didn't want everything to become white and sleek and clean and lifeless, but I wanted to still make it somewhat charming, to at least still make it a street worthy of a theme park. Anyway, after doing that, I figured it was right about time to actually get into the entrance building itself. And now this is quite interesting because it's a bit of a contemporary classical building, in a sense that I am really just drawing from classical temples and arches and such, but doing it in a very simple geometric sense. So I'm using a lot of the art primitive pieces actually, and a lot of the simple roof pillars and anything that has a very flat texture and shape to it to make this building here. So while it still follows pretty much the conventions of any classical building, with having the pillars, some arches in the middle to actually make it still a little bit more fancy and add some detailing to it, and on top of that having the architrave and frieze, it's all very simple. So it's reflecting the general look of a classical sort of gate like this, but in a very modern, simple way. And I figured this was a good way to get along with the look of the tower, because especially around the base of the tower I had those sort of pillars going round, which very much reminded me of round Roman temples. And yeah, that's why I figured having an entrance like this in very much similar colors and a generally similar style to the tower in the middle of the park would make sure that these two structures are kind of working hand in hand as you're approaching the park. And a detail which at this point in this episode is not gonna happen yet, but is still somewhat interesting to mention, is that I'm not gonna leave the top of the building like this. At the moment it is just flat, but in some future episodes I'll be putting the PAX logo on top of that, because one of the sort of things that we had to do in order to submit our park and actually make it work for PAX East was to incorporate the PAX logo in some way, either in the entrance building or in some kind of centerpiece for the park. And my sort of mind, which was winging this entire episode, just figured that putting the PAX logo on the entrance would probably work best, because you'd have these two similar structures kind of working together with the entrance building and the observation tower, and then sort of in the middle of that, and very much being a very bright red logo that immediately gets your attention. There is the big PAX logo on top of the entrance building, and that should hopefully make very clear what this park is and what it's all about to any guests in-game, I guess, walking into the park, but also anybody looking at the park and starting at the entrance. And I'm just finishing the wings of the station here for a couple of reasons. Partly just to have that space where you can actually have the ticket booths, where you can buy your ticket realistically. Obviously that's not something I have to keep in mind for Planet Coaster, but it's just a small detail that I at least wanted to keep in mind to keep some sort of belief that this could be a real theme park. And also to kind of cover up what is going to be behind this, because right behind this I'll have the Mainstreet, and instead of having the ugly sides of buildings, I just wanted to make sure that I had one wide, coherent entrance building. So I'm trying to cover up what is going to be behind these areas in the Mainstreet by making the entrance building a bit wider on the sides here. And again, this was a pretty good time to make use of the copy tools in Planet Coaster and just grab that entire part, copy it around to the other side, and that is basically it for the entrance building. It's quite simple, but so is the rest of the park pretty much, and in the end I'm quite happy with it, even though it's a very simple and quick sort of way to get to where I wanted to. I think it still kind of works. It's an entrance that gets your attention but not too much, still draws you into the park, but you can already kind of see the glimpse of the observation tower in the distance, much like you can see the glimpse of the Cinderella's castle or whatever castle in one of the Disney parks at the beginning of the Mainstreet. So just to dress everything up a little bit more and add some more detail to it, I figured I would place some of these planters on the side. I will definitely work a bit more on this plaza in the future and add some extra trees and foliage to it at some point. But at this point I was really only concerned with finishing it to the point. Okay, I've been saying that word too much in my last sentences, but I was really just concerned with making sure that I had enough of the first plaza to kind of get an idea of what that was going to look like, so that I could finally move into the Mainstreet and actually experiment a bit more with that. And before I did that, I wanted to quickly make some fancy paths over here. At this point I was still being very naive and thinking that I could actually make pathworks like this in the rest of the park. There's no way I could. It just takes way too much time, and it's also not the best thing for your computer. But anyway, at this point it is about time that we get into the Mainstreet. I just realized there's that point again. But yeah, we're getting into the Mainstreet, and this is quite interesting and quite weird, and also most likely going to be quite polarizing, since it's a weirdly contemporary Mainstreet. I'm not going with any traditional styles or anything, since that would very much just clash with the look of the observation tower. But I'm also not going with a sort of past future vision of sci-fi architecture or anything that is very fantastical or from any kind of modern fantasy. I'm really just going with some kind of building style that could almost fit in a new urbanist part of a city, and is really almost more like an actual city street than a main street. And one of the first buildings that I wanted to try here is just a simple building with two parts. Actually, many of these buildings are going to be built up of two parts, and I'm not sure why, but the building just keeps reminding me of a bit of a Japanese style to it. Still not exactly sure why, but it's a modern building with some stone detailing, and I would say for especially buildings like these, which are very simple, and I'm really just keeping it to clean lines and geometric shapes in these buildings. For these kinds of buildings, the texturing for me was the most important thing, and much of this main street was also just an experiment with different styles. I don't think all of these buildings really succeeded on an equal level, and some of them definitely don't even fit that well into a theme park, but I think they've all been pretty good experimentations and like short little messabouts with the pieces in Planet Coaster, especially when it comes to textures, because when you're building like this, the texture and the way that the material looks is just so important in the way that a building in the end looks. So I was really happy to see how the colors of the stone work together to sort of give you this very muted natural stone look. Also the way that the stone pillar pieces together can give you these very thick stone walls that you can surround a building with is something that I really liked about this building, and I just figured it would be much more interesting than just a simple box out of simple shapes, because that was something I wanted to avoid. And this sort of brings me to the topic that I wanted to discuss about architecture. Even though I am not very knowledgeable about modern architecture at all, I've never followed anything in that field, and it's just a bit of an, I guess, an interest. But something that I thought was very interesting when I looked this up for the park to actually talk about this is that there's actually a very clear difference between contemporary architecture and modern architecture, and they're very often just lumped together as the same kind of thing, which nobody knows exactly what it is, but everybody knows when they see it. But they're actually very different things, and modern architecture is essentially not that modern in a sense that it mostly refers to a style of architecture which was very popular in the early 20th century, also the sort of mid 20th century. And contemporary architecture is not a specific style of architecture, but anything that's being built right now. But as I understand it, it's also mostly used to not refer to anything that's built right now that is, for instance, still looking like very old architecture, like classical. It's also not referring to anything being built right now that's very futuristic. It's anything that's built right now that doesn't really fit in those exact categories that it isn't, is basically contemporary architecture. So contemporary is really the style of the current year in a sense, and modern is a bit of an old style from quite a few years ago actually. And as far as I understand, most of these buildings are much more contemporary than they're actually modern, even though most people actually call these buildings modern because that's kind of how you feel about it. At least that's what I would have called them not too long ago. But for instance, some things which make these buildings a bit more interesting and would probably make them more modern than, or really would make them more contemporary than modern, is for instance this little cantilever on the building which I'm building right now, which is the wooden part that sticks out like this, and it kind of breaks up from the rest of the building. If it were a modern building, it would probably still have the same height as the rest of the building. The entire building would have probably been the white plaster, and everything would have fit together in a very simple, elegant way. But instead, I sort of chose to lift this part that sticks out up from the rest of the building, give it a different texture, arrange it differently so that it really sticks out from the rest of the building. And that's more of a thing that contemporary buildings do. It's also something that is very much like all of the modern houses that people build in Minecraft, which I never quite found an exact style for, but it's that kind of style which I guess you could very much compare to what I'm doing here. But mostly I was just having fun, just messing about with the textures in the game. And one of the things that I really wanted to try was to kind of create my own glass. If not entirely, but I wanted to have some glass-ish texture that would at least have a color that could potentially look like some glass, even though looking at it, I'm not too sure about it. But the reason I wanted to try that was because the in-game windows just don't really work for this kind of architecture, and I also wanted to avoid the in-game modern windows, since they have a very strict framing to them that I didn't want to use for these windows. So instead I took up the 3D, what are they called again, the art primitive shapes, and made them out of that. Which I guess is alright. You can definitely tell that it's not actually glass, and I could have still messed with that a little bit hopefully, but in the context and having some foliage around it and having the people around it, as well as some more detailing, I think it works well enough, and it definitely gets the idea of the building across. So moving on to what is going to be the last building of the main street for now, I wanted to finally build a bit of a simple new urbanist-ish row house out of bricks. And again, my main thing that I kind of wanted to try here was to combine different sort of washed out colors to make the bricks look as nice as I could, and not make them too cartoony like bricks often turn out in Planet Coaster, but also not make them too medieval or rustic, but hopefully get the texture just right for that sort of, that muted, very contemporary look, I guess. And that's something that I was trying out here. And again, I'm trying to make my own windows since the in-game windows didn't have the exact spacing that I was looking for. And that is basically going to be the entire building. It's very simple and it's very straight to the point. I did want to make it as clean as I could, which is why I ended up using these stucco pillars instead of using any wall arches or anything like that, because I wanted the entrance to be perfectly square and perfectly seamless with the toilets. But that aside, it's just a very simple building. But I think it goes, well, for this building goes what for many of the other buildings go as well, is that they're very simple in terms of look, but still some of the objects, to quite a few objects, actually make them happen. And they definitely go against what you're supposed to do with these kinds of objects in Planet Coaster. I haven't said yet that I would really love to get into some more like modern architecture in Planet Coaster at some point in the future. If maybe at some point we possibly have some glass pieces, like making skyscrapers and stuff like that, is something that I would love to try and always like to mess around with a little bit in Roller Coaster Tycoon 3, and I haven't really had the opportunity to do so in Planet Coaster so far, but it's definitely something that I might try at some point in the future. Anyway, we now have toilets in the park, and it's the only point of entrance, or only point of interest. Jesus, what happened to my English? But it's the only thing that people can really go to in the parks, and everybody is just going to the toilet and leaving the park again, so that's pretty swell. And I think that's also all for the Main Street attractions that people can actually go to. Literally, people are just able to go to the toilet for this section of the Main Street. I didn't want to break up the other buildings by placing any facilities in it, because that would sort of break the perfect sort of clean look that the buildings had so far. But I will definitely feature some more modern or some more actual facilities in the Main Street. So there will actually be some info places and some food and drink stuffs. But for now, the toilet is where we're standing, and that's all I have for now. Funnily enough, this will actually be the only toilet in the park, which I was not so sure about when I finished the park, whether I should really keep it that way. But I checked the guests and nobody was complaining about the lack of toilets. There were some thirsty people and some hungry people, but apparently the people are fine with having one set of toilets at the entrance of the park. So, I mean, I guess I'll take that. I have no idea why that's even the case. But honestly, if they're all served by these toilets and they're okay with walking to the other side of the park, I'll take it. It's not something I'm gonna complain, because it's more or less the opposite of a problem for my case here. So yeah, that's just gonna be the toilets that everybody's gonna have to deal with for the rest of their stay in the park. They're gonna probably end up being the worst and the most smelly toilets ever. But then again, toilets in a theme park are... Well, actually, no, they're not that bad. What am I complaining about? The toilets in my theme park are probably just bad. But placing the trees in the Main Street just made me realize how much trees just make everything look better, and I wish there could be streets like everywhere where there were just streets around both the sides. Sadly, there are way too many streets in this world without trees, and that is a very sad thing indeed, because trees are awesome. What's also awesome is some lights around the edges of the building, kind of reflecting the lights that I had around the observation tower. It's literally just that same kind of theme, and especially if you would be looking at the entrance at night and seeing the entrance with the observation tower in the distance, the idea is that they'll have this sort of matching style in terms of the lights. There we go. That should give you a pretty good idea of how it's going to look eventually. And we have that interesting sort of neon outline to both of the buildings, which should hopefully make them fit in quite well together. Now, as a general lighting tip, and I've used this plenty of times before, but I haven't really explicitly given a shout out before, as a little lighting tip, which I got from Nighty a very long time ago. So if you're watching this, thanks man. A very quick lighting tip was that I usually do use the area lights to light up all of my areas, because they have a light source that actually extends out of the light itself, so you can use it to very sneakily light up buildings without actually making visible lights. So that's something I wanted to quickly end this video with, because I'm out of the time lapse. So thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.